Hi, welcome everybody. So my name's Jen and I'm one of the Shine volunteers. I've been a network leader for quite a few years now, and I have had breast cancer, and I have a background in biomedical research, really. So I'm a little bit of a science nerd, which is why Kynwin's asked me to host this session. So today we've got a really interesting session and some interesting speakers on clinical trials. And the reason we are doing this session is because we've got quite, is something that comes up quite a lot in our community, is how to access really clinical trials and questions about really finding clinical trials. So we just wanted to bring to members of our community how to find out a little bit more information about that, and the ability to ask all of our speakers here today any questions. So if you do have any questions while our speakers are speaking, if you want to pop them into the chat, and we're going to collate any questions during the talks, and we'll ask them at the end. So at the end we're going to have a little bit of a question and answer session. So if you do have any questions during the time, just pop them in the chat, and we'll save them to the end if that's so please enjoy this. We've got three speakers, as I say. We've got Leslie, who is a breast cancer. She had breast cancer, stage 4 breast cancer, and actually has a really interesting story because she was a clinical trial patient, or is a clinical trial patient, sorry, I should say, and is now 6 years, I think, 6 years, is that correct? Still on a clinical trial drug. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to hearing that story. And we've got Vivian, who is a senior research nurse based in Edinburgh, and she's been involved in a wide range of cancer research roles. So she's got really interesting background in different, I think, Make Seconds Count, I think she's involved in as well. So she's going to talk a little bit about that. And we've got Helen, who's a clinical trial nurse with Blood Cancer UK as well. So we've got quite a wide range of different experiences to hear from. So we're going to hear from each of those speakers, starting with Leslie. So I'm going to pass over to Leslie now.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Yeah, and thanks for inviting me today to talk about my personal experience of clinical trials. So I live in Edinburgh, in Scotland, with my 4 children, and was first diagnosed with metastatic HER2 breast cancer in 2014, completely out of the blue, de novo, as they say. I just thought I had a chest infection or asthma or something, but no, it was breast cancer that's already spread into my liver, my lungs, and my bones. So I used to joke that my cancer had moved faster than Usain Bolt on a good day, but really this was pretty awful news. I was told I had 2 to 3 years to live, which was a huge shock. And I'm sure some of you listening today will remember the moment you were maybe told that you not just that you had cancer, but that it was advanced and incurable. The shock of being told out of the blue like that you have incurable cancer and that you've lost all those milestones that others take for granted is unimaginable. So my life became dominated, and pretty much still is, by medical appointments, scans and tests. Year 1 of treatment was spent enduring 12 cycles of fairly brutal chemotherapy. And it made a good job of reducing the cancer to a few places in my lungs. And I was kept on a maintenance drug that many of you might know called Herceptin. But I had decided very early on in my treatment journey that I had to find a trial at some point. I had a friend with myeloma who was on a clinical, she lives in Edinburgh, but on a clinical trial at the Marsden after her stem cell transplant had failed. And the pharma company were even paying for her to travel between Edinburgh and London every month. She was doing really well, and that drug is now one of the standard treatments for myeloma, I believe. So when I heard her story, I decided I had to try and find a clinical trial for myself. The idea that a trial might help give me a longer life than the predicted 2 to 3 years, it drove me on, and it gave me hope. So despite absolutely no research background, I took on, there's a terrible, well, it's not terrible, an international sort of database of trials that some of you might know called clinicaltrials.gov. It's awful from a patient perspective. It's very unpatient friendly, but I would spend literally hours trawling through it, looking for trials that I might be eligible for. But it's pretty technical and medical. I would send my very open-minded oncologist lists of those trials, and I was looking in the UK, not just in the UK, but also Europe. So I was desperate to find something that would just give me another treatment line, basically. My oncologist eventually suggested a local Edinburgh trial, and as part of the routine testing to start on the trial, because you have to undergo an awful lot of tests, I had a full brain and body scan, and that was going to provide the kind of benchmark against which the doctors would measure whether the drug was working, the trial was working. To my horror, the scan revealed that I had 3 small brain mets, despite having absolutely no symptoms. And the brain mets meant I wasn't eligible for that trial anymore. And that's my first realization of how restrictive some of the criteria are for trials, how difficult it can be to access one. But I now, all these years later, I now kind of look on that as a moment where at least the trial screening helped me to find those brain mets early on. I hate to think what would have happened if I'd not had that brain scan. So the mets were treated with whole brain radiotherapy, and I'm incredibly fortunate that they've never come back. I then went on 2 more lines of targeted HER2 treatment, and neither of them worked. And at that point, I was basically out of options. And this was October 2015. So I went off to New York with the family on what I thought might be my last holiday. And when I got back, my amazing oncologist in Edinburgh offered me either another line of chemo, more chemo, which I really didn't want to have, or the last place on a phase 1B early stage trial in Glasgow at the Beatson Centre. And I really had absolutely nothing to lose, so I took the trial option, and I had an immediate and very strong response to it. I kept a diary at the time, and I mean, at that point, I couldn't walk up the stairs. There was so much cancer in my lungs. And within 10 days, I was able to not quite skip up the stairs, but I found it an awful lot easier. And then after 3 cycle scan showed that I'd had this unbelievable response. And whereas before my lungs looked like some sort of Jackson Pollock painting with white splodges and cancer all over them, it hadn't completely gone, but hugely reduced. But it was luck. It was a great oncologist and also just determination on my part that got me onto that trial. And as Jenna said, 6 years on, I mean, it's just a miracle. I didn't expect this at all. I'm still on the same trial. I'm now on compassionate use access though, and there has been some progression in my lungs. I've currently got, last summer I had to get part of my lung removed. Currently I've got a small single active tumour on my right lung, which we will probably just blast with some radiotherapy. But because the drug is keeping most of the cancer under control, and I've got a really good quality of life on this drug, I'm being allowed to stay on it for as long as is sensible. So we're being quite pragmatic about it, which is great. And in the 6 years on this trial, I've managed to lead a pretty much normal life with very few side effects, and had some amazing experiences with the family. So we've cycled across the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. We've sailed down the coast of Croatia. But most importantly for me, I've had a chance to see some of those milestones that I thought I would miss. And I've also, because I've reacted so well to the drug, I've managed to get involved in a lot of patient advocacy work. And in this time, I've spoken to many patients and been with advanced cancer who don't seem to know anything about trials, or are never offered one and never have the opportunity to access one. 4 years ago, I joined a group some of you might have heard of called the NCRI as a patient advocate. And this year we ran the first ever UK-wide survey asking metastatic breast cancer patients about their experiences and understanding of clinical trials. And the results of that survey confirmed what I had suspected. And we had over 700 responses, but only 14% of those people had been on a trial. Only 23% had had a discussion with their oncologist about trials. And although the majority seemed to be willing to travel to access a trial, many misunderstood what trials about. They thought they'd be given a placebo or it was a last resort. And I just think with that, now we've got some data, we absolutely need to do something about this. And I'm sure no matter what cancer type the survey, we'd be talking about, I think the messages and that would come out of it would be pretty much the same. And patients really do deserve more. So when I joined a small charity called Make Seconds Count about 2 years ago, the charity supports men and women with metastatic breast cancer. I suggested we look at funding a nurse to raise awareness of clinical trials amongst patients, to give them the knowledge and the confidence to ask their clinical team about trials, because it's not easy sometimes to raise that. It really depends on how open-minded your oncologist is, what kind of relationship you've got with them, and then to look to match them to trials. So we've run we've been running a very successful pilot over the last 7 months and are about to expand it. And Vivian, who runs the service for the charity, is here today, and I believe is now going to talk to you a bit more about that, but also about clinical trials in general. So that's all I wanted to say about my personal story, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Leslie. That's brilliant. Thank you. Can I just ask one question before we pass on to Vivian? For Leslie, before we. One thing was, can you just explain to everybody what your compassionate use access is?
Yeah, I think it's. You might be better asking Vivian and Helen that. I didn't even, at one point, I didn't even know I was on compassionate use access. But it's basically a scheme that most pharma companies, I believe, will run for patients and enables them to get access to a drug that otherwise might not be available to them. So I believe with some drugs that you can get that haven't been that might have been licensed maybe but not approved in the UK, you can access them. In my case, I think I was moved on to that scheme probably about 3 years after I'd been on the trial, and I suspect the pharma company had my data. They had the information they wanted about my response to the drug, and they seemed very happy for me to just, even though I have had some progression, and normally when you're on a clinical trial and there's progression, normally at that point, I believe you have to come off the trial. But because I was doing so well, and I at the moment, there are no other lines of treatment for me after this, to be honest.
Is that to allow you to continue on the drug past
continue on the drug? Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that, I just wanted to clarify that in case anybody was wondering. I just wondered, so I thought other people might wonder as well. So thank you for that. Thanks. And we'll hand over to Vivian now. Thank you so much, Leslie. That was really interesting. Thanks.
Hi everybody. Nice to see you all, or some of you anyway. So just following on from Leslie, I'm Vivian Wilson. I'm a senior research nurse based at the Edinburgh Cancer Centre. I work for Cancer Research UK. I'm the senior nurse for the Edinburgh Cancer Centre there. But for the last 7 or 8 months, I've been working with the charity Make Seconds Count in a patient trials advocate role. And as Leslie was talking about, sort of helping patients to potentially find clinical trials for them, but also just to empower them to have those conversations with their consultant. And I think Helen will explain our role a little bit more once I've given just a brief overview of a few things that I think are relevant in relation to clinical trials. A lot of people, you hear some different stories. People have different ideas of what clinical trials are. So I've just got a very brief PowerPoint presentation, just a few slides to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that I think are relevant, and maybe hopefully along the way just dispel a few of those myths. So that's my plan. So I'm just going to share my screen, which I hope will work. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? Give me a nod there, that's lovely. So, lovely. So just to give you a bit of an idea of the sort of things I'm going to cover. So just, this is all very briefly, but there's lots of time at the end for questions, so feel free. But just touch on a few things, what clinical trials are, a little bit about the types of trials that you get, touch on phases of trials and why that's significant if you are ever approached about a clinical trial. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the advantages that patients report about being on a study. And then finally, what would happen if you were approached about a clinical trial. So, working with Cancer Research UK, we have some lovely quotes from them. So Cancer Research UK say that trials aim to find out if a new treatment or a procedure is safe, is better than our current treatment, or has fewer side effects. And obviously we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. So what are clinical trials? So big thing to remember is that clinical trials are potentially available for patients at lots of different time points. It's not just when you have run out of treatment options. There can potentially be clinical trials for patients at lots of different time points. Also worth remembering, a lot of patients kind of get slightly worried that they think they're going to be on a drug that's never been tested before, we don't know anything about it. In fact, a lot of our cancer trials have licensed drugs in them already. It might be that we're testing them for another disease type. So we've got a trial, for example, looking at a drug called crizotinib, licensed in lung cancer, but actually there's a clinical trial looking at it for use in a specific type of breast cancer. Lots of trials like that. Also, it might be the licensed drug in the same disease site, but potentially used at a different time point. Could be with another drug, might be on its own, could be with another new drug or an existing other drug. So often in combination. And then of course we do have the new and the novel therapies. And I would say in the last maybe 15, 20 years, and more so in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been a real explosion of some of these targeted therapies, immunotherapies, really exciting treatments coming through. So they might be given alongside another drug, they might be given on their own. And also worth remembering that not every study, every clinical trial is a drug study. So we have things called biomarker studies or translational type studies. That might be where you're just giving potentially a blood sample, but that can tell us a lot about your cancer and potentially help us in the bigger population as well. So a number of studies like that. And then of course, quality of life studies, always looking to try and improve a patient's quality of life with some of these cancer treatments, because as many of you will know, they can be so extremely toxic. And then also worth remembering that not every clinical trial is a drug study. So we have surgical studies, radiotherapy studies, looking at lots of new different procedures, as well as their drugs. So real variety, and I think that's the point I'm trying to make. You know, people sort of concentrate on one clinical trial and say, oh, I don't want to go into that. Actually, there's so many different trials. So it's really important to find out about the trial that you might be being approached about to get the idea of what it involves. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is improve our existing cancer treatments so that we can advance our understanding of how those cancers develop, so that we can develop better combinations of treatments for our patients and tailor those treatments for individual patients, not giving everybody the same drug. I want to come on very briefly to phases of a study, and the reason it's important is because, again, if you were ever approached about a clinical study, you'll want to know whether it's a phase 1, a phase 2 or a phase 3, because they differ quite significantly. So just very quickly, just to run through, phase 1 study is the first time it's being given. It's been discovered in the lab. It might be a drug that we know already, but it comes into a phase 1 setting, and we give a tiny amount of drug, and ultimately what we're looking for is how safe it is. Is it tolerated by our patient? This is the stage in this phase where we maybe do more blood sampling or more tests, more investigations. So it can be quite intense. Small numbers of patients, and then we increase our dose gradually. We call that our dose finding phase. And if that shows some promise, and lots of them don't, lots of them fall by the wayside. You know, Leslie's didn't progress onto another stage. It stopped recruiting despite being so amazing for Leslie. But if these phase 1 studies show some promise, it would then go on to a phase 2 study. This is when we start to look for the therapeutic effect. So starting to see some direct benefit. And again, don't forget Leslie's experience in a phase 1. She received benefit and is receiving benefit, but it tends to be in the phase 2 studies. This is when we tend to see, because we have the dose that we're looking at now, a therapeutic effect. We need larger numbers of patients, and this is when we potentially start to see the side effects developing. Phase 3 study, by this time now, we found our dose, we can anticipate what the side effects are going to be and prepare our patients for that, give them some, say, antiemetics or anything that might help our patients to make those side effects more tolerable. Start to see some benefit, but to do that, we need larger numbers of patients. So now we're comparing our gold standard, our current standard of therapy, and we want to know, is it superior or is it equally as good and maybe less toxic? And just a few advantages, not advantages for everybody, because some of these advantages aren't advantages to every patient. But there was a relatively big study that was done fairly recently, and they were looking at patients' experiences that had taken part in a clinical trial. And these are just a few of the things that patients reported. So first and foremost, access to an otherwise unavailable drug, potentially a superior treatment to a current standard of care. Closer follow-up and monitoring, more scans and tests, but remembering the phases of study, they tend to be more frequent in the earlier phases. By the time we get to a phase 3, we're trying to keep it as near to standard of care as we possibly can. And again, not everybody likes more scans and more tests and more follow-up and more monitoring. Some people don't like that. So what's seen as an advantage for some can be seen as a disadvantage for others. But a lot of our patients do appreciate that closer monitoring. And some other things that our patients report are easier access to a specialist nurse and one-to-one care, because in these studies, you tend to have a small group of research nurses that will care for a specific study, so you're more likely to see the same person again and again. So how are they delivered? So usually run in our NHS hospitals, given in a dedicated area or a clinical research facility, always followed to a protocol. Every study has its own protocol, and we as research staff follow that to the letter, so that when we analyse our data, we know, hand on heart, what the evidence suggests is accurate. It's delivered by dedicated research staff if it's an unlicensed product, and this is when you might get some additional blood sampling and scans, occasionally a one-off biopsy, not routinely, but it can happen. And then just a word on placebos. It would be unethical of us to give a placebo to a patient with cancer, so we don't use them very often. But occasionally you might see them if it's alongside a standard of care. So care isn't compromised, but you might have a treatment that you would receive routinely, but there might be an additional drug to bring in. And what might happen is some of our patients might receive therefore the placebo, and the others might receive that additional drug. But again, hearing the word placebo when you're reading something about a clinical trial can put some of our patients off. So please just consider that, and just remember that every study is different. Read the information that they're going to give you and then make your decision. So very quickly, what happens to a patient? So the doctor will usually approach the patient at the clinic, let them know if there's a clinical trial or what their standard of care treatment might be. If the patient's interested, they will be given an information sheet about the study and allows them time to go home and spend some time thinking about it, maybe discussing it with their family, the GP, and time to ask questions. So time to ask questions with a research nurse, maybe in person or by phone. We've been doing a lot of it by phone, as you can imagine, during COVID. I can't remember what's behind that. Can you all see my lovely 3 people in front of me? I can't remember what's there. Bear with me a second. Can't see that either. Let me see if I can move this. There we go. Written consent.
Yeah.
Perfect. So written consent, we don't do anything before we have consent from a patient. Then, once we've got that, we can then do some baseline tests, which can be organised. We would start treatment only once that's been done in a dedicated research facility. Patients are followed up closely, and worth remembering that patients can withdraw from a study at any time, don't need to give a reason for it, but patients tend to withdraw from a study or come off study when they have some progression, or if the drug is no longer working for them, or if they have intolerable side effects, something along those lines. Back now. So just finally, before I hand over to Helen, just worth remembering how to access a clinical trial. So for patients with secondary breast cancer and for people with any blood cancer, there is a service on our websites, Blood Cancer UK and Make Seconds Count, referral forms that you can use and ask Helen or I to do a search for you, or just talk about clinical trials generally. And I think Helen will talk about that in a little bit more detail. But I think the most important thing to remember is, for everybody, anybody who is remotely interested and just is keeping their options open, remember the best thing you can do is ask your consultant about trials. It's genuinely okay to ask. And by letting them know that you're potentially interested, it makes them think about that. And I think that's all I have. Yep, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I hope that's been helpful. Just very, very brief. I could talk about clinical trials for a very long time. But I'm going to hand over to Helen now, but there's lots of time at the end for questions.
Thanks so much, Vivienne. That was really comprehensive. Thank you for that. And we're going to quickly pass over to Helen now.
Thanks very much, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helen McNaught and I work for Blood Cancer UK. I joined them last year in June from a background working in the NHS, which has always been in blood cancer. So I've very much seen patients of very differing stages and age groups within blood cancer journeys and within different disease groups within blood cancer. I spent some time working on wards as a clinical trials nurse, as a research nurse. So I've had quite a wonderful overview of the journeys that patients experience going through treatment for blood cancer. And I suppose probably pertinent to this meeting today is I'm very driven by clinical trials through my own personal experience as well. And it's very relevant to what Leslie and Vivienne have been saying as well. Back in 1995, my brother, who was 6 at the time, was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And he started his treatment, and we were told at the time that he had a 30% chance of survival due to the type of acute lymphoblastic leukemia, or the subtype that he'd been diagnosed with. So he commenced his treatment, and about a month into the treatment, my parents were approached by his consultant, who suggested that he went on to a clinical trial. And essentially the treatment at that time was that children were irradiated. So they received complete irradiation for the CNS, for the brain, for the spinal cord. And they were wanting to remove this component, and they were wanting to test to see whether methotrexate, if it was inserted into the spine, whether that would have a better efficacy and whether it be a kind of treatment to children. And the outcome of that clinical trial is that the protocol very much hasn't changed since 1995, but in the same group of children, there is now a over 95% survival rate. So I suppose in essence, when we're talking about clinical trials and the importance, and like we were saying about when you would go on to a clinical trial, it can be at varying different time points. And we know that it is a really complex decision for patients to make, and that they encounter really huge barriers when it comes to thinking about clinical trials. And some of these barriers are geographical barriers, because it's not easy to travel for a clinical trial that's not available locally to you. Sometimes the barriers that patients experience are where you're just trying to have that communication with your treating team about clinical trials. Quite often patients are overwhelmed just by the magnitude of information that they're presented with when it comes to clinical trials. And it's just that sheer complexity of having to make choices about your treatment, and it's not straightforward, and we really, really do appreciate that. And essentially that's why Vivienne and myself run these services that are aimed at helping patients wade through these barriers. So both of the services essentially have been born out of need. They've been driven through patient passion, patients like Leslie that have wanted to change the clinical landscape for others, and for patients to have better options in the future. And really essentially having all the options that could be available to you when it comes to thinking about your cancer treatment. So our counterparts transatlantically have been running similar services for very, very many years with great success. And essentially what we have been trying to do is emulate that here in the UK. And both Leslie and I have experienced over the last year or so that this is a very, very needed service. So the services that Vivian and I run, which are very, very similar to one another, even though Vivian is within the secondary breast cancer space and I'm within the blood cancer space, is that we're there to help patients and support them to find clinical trials that they may be eligible for. We help them break down complex information that is surrounding clinical trials. We help them with those communication issues that they might be having with their treating team. And we also help them make a more informed decision about the treatment, because sometimes what happens is we do talk to patients who have been offered a clinical trial, but after deeper conversation, we realize, or we come to a point in that conversation where we realize that a clinical trial is not what's relevant for them. So it's really trying to help patients find the treatment pathway that works best for them, fits for them, makes sense to them, and that it's a truly informed process, and that they understand what the implications of either going on to a standard of care treatment pathway are, or a clinical trial. And unfortunately, it's not something that is emulated across all different disease groups, and it's something that we really, really hope to see in the future, because we know that there's an unmet need in every single cancer disease group across every single age group. And we're really, really hopeful that in the future that other organisations will be able to run similar sorts of services. We know that there are some useful organisations out there that have trials finders, and we can pop some of those links into the chats if it's helpful to anybody today. But what we do know that is, even when you do go and look at these trials finders, that the information is very, very rarely patient friendly. But what we would say to you today is, if you ever wanted to talk to either Vivian or myself about a clinical trial, please do contact us. But we would say that at the end of the day, the most important person in your treatment journey is you. And we would always say, advocate strongly for yourself. And if you can't advocate for yourself, have somebody with you who can advocate for you. It is okay to ask about research. It's okay to ask about clinical trials. And at the end of the day, you know, sometimes what you do need to do when there's so much noise in the NHS is to be a bastion of your own care. And so do look at resources, particularly on Make Seconds Count and Blood Cancer UK, because even if it falls out with a pure disease group, there's some really fantastic information on there that could help guide you through the process. And that's all from me. I'll hand back to Jen.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you all very much for your inputs. There was one question that came up during, I think, when Vivian was talking, from somebody who was asking about the in the phase 1. She's going in a phase 1 trial in January, but her she's been told that the drug's then going to be removed in May, and she wasn't sure. He wasn't sure what that meant. I'm not sure if she wasn't sure. I don't know, Vivian, if you could clarify if you had any ideas about that. Does that mean that it's just a short trial?
So there's, as I was saying earlier, there's lots of different types of trials. So it might be, there's various different things that it could be. So it might be that they think the trial might be closing, but if somebody starts on a clinical trial and they start on a treatment, then it wouldn't be stopped unless it was appropriate to be stopped. So if the patient was to continue on treatment, then they wouldn't recruit that patient if they thought the drug was only going to be available till May. They just wouldn't do that. They would close that. So perhaps it might be a clinical trial where they are using a drug that is appropriate. Some of our studies, thinking of lots of different breast cancer studies, you know, where it might be appropriate, you know, in some of our treatments where you have 8 cycles of something, or you have a treatment for 6 months. Some of our hormonal therapies you have for years. So it's difficult to say without knowing the specifics of that type of trial, you know what I mean? But the fact that it is a phase 1 study is absolutely fabulous that they're going on to that. So there'll be a reason why that drug is only going to be there until May. It's not because, well, the trial's closing so you can only get it for 4 months, because that wouldn't be ethical. So they wouldn't do that.
And if somebody was put on a drug in a phase 1 trial and had a good response to it, presumably they're not just suddenly going to be taken off that drug. You know, they would be.
So
That would be unethical in itself.
Yeah. So what does tend to happen, you know, we can anticipate. So when we open a study is opened, so we have a start date, a planned start date, and because of the bureaucracy within clinical trials, it can take longer than anticipated. But when a trial does actually open, it has a number of years before it closes, because we anticipate how long those patients will be on that study for and for how long we can follow them up for. However, things change. People are unique, people are different, so therefore things can change. Look at Leslie's example. You know, that was a phase 1 study, a treatment for so long that they would have not anticipated that being a drug for use for such a long period of time. I can think of another gentleman that I looked after a few years ago. He had a sarcoma. Again, phase 1 study, he did remarkably well on it. We anticipated he may have been on it for 3 months, 6 months, or however long. He was on it for much longer. Same idea on compassionate grounds, where the drug company agrees this patient is doing well on it, unethical to stop it, and continued.
I was going to ask about Leslie's drug in particular. It's quite interesting that obviously that drug didn't progress past the phase 1 stage. So obviously overall it wasn't a successful trial, but was obviously extremely successful for Leslie. And you know, you hear about these things, you know, it's just, it can be very, very individualistic, obviously, as cancer is. What happens to these kind of drugs that may be very successful for individual cancer profiles? Is there anything written up about them that people can find out about? Is there any published data on those phase 1 trials that are then almost dumped later on, that, you know, because somebody may have a similar cancer to Leslie that drug might be useful for, but that drug's no longer available, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I used to ask, because other patients I knew with metastatic HER2 breast cancer, constantly saying, how can I get on this trial? My understanding when I started on it all those years ago was that there were only 36 patients in the UK and a centre in France on the trial. And my oncologist has told me he views it as a very successful drug. So although I'm the longest surviving living person with it, other patients did very, very well also. And I'd keep saying to him, when is it going to move to phase 2? When are we going to start being able to offer this to more patients and more centres? And he could never give me an answer. And often I mean, I've only got this to base my experience on, but it felt like the communication, it's a Japanese drug company, the communication between the drug company and the trial investigators, and certainly the patients, is really, really poor, really poor. And they did publish the data, the phase 1 data on this drug. My oncologist thinks that maybe there were sort of political issues within the company that meant there were competing project teams looking for funds to take the trial to phase 2, because it does require a huge amount of investment to run these trials and the different phases of them. So he thought maybe that was it. Finally, last year, I got the answer, which is that the Japanese company had sold the rights for the drug to a Chinese pharma company, and this Chinese company are going to develop the drug for the Asian Chinese market, which is presumably enormous. So the drug is still I presume there's a phase 2 trial going on somewhere there, but unfortunately not available in the West. But there's all this going on, I think, behind the scenes that I really don't know much about. But I was very frustrated that it couldn't be offered to anybody else after me, because, and also I believe the class of drug it's called a TKI. There are a few other TKI drugs out there already in that space, maybe a bit, and my oncologist thinks my drug is less toxic, is better. But because of that competition, he also thought maybe that was a reason why they didn't take it forward in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the frustrating thing about these things. There are political elements to it, and cost involvements, and and the number of people that it's going to be helping versus cost, and that always comes into it as well with drugs. Frustrating. Okay, thanks for that. It's interesting to know the background. We had another question about where else can you go to other sources of information if your oncologist is not very forthcoming about clinical trials? Is there someone else? I think this is maybe if it's not, you've mentioned about blood cancer and breast cancer specifically, other cancers. Is there anywhere else for cancers in general, more generally, that you would go to for information about clinical trials?
I think reading the question, it says that the oncologist is not particularly talkative. So what I would think about there is there might be a little bit of a communication breakdown, and sometimes it's very, very difficult to ascertain what the problem is, because if you've got an appetite to ask about clinical trials and to talk about them, and you've got getting a bit of an unresponsive consultant, what I would say to you is maybe there is something there that they know that you don't know, and it's worth directly asking that question. But secondly, it might just be that it's a complex relationship, and so it comes back to advocating for yourself, and both Vivian and I are huge bastions when it comes to the NHS. We love the NHS, but we know that it is under great pressures, and that some things don't work the way that they should do. We know that clinical trials, the inequity is absolutely huge. You only need to live in the north of Scotland to know that you don't have the same opportunities as somebody that's based in England, or particularly in the south of England. So what I would always say to you is that if you're finding that those conversations are not working with your treating team and you do want to talk about these things, then you will have to go to your second option and say that you would like to talk to somebody else. The other thing to do is, if you're not getting any further with that particular treating team at that particular hospital, you can talk to your GP about having a referral somewhere else to another hospital. But again, this is where, unfortunately, a little bit of desk research might come in, because if you have that information, sometimes taking it to your treating team and saying, this is the information I have, I'm pretty sure this is something I would be eligible for, I want to talk about it. If you've got that appetite to travel, then they really shouldn't be turning you away because you're saying that there's something that you're ready and prepared to do. I hope that answers the question a little bit. I think what all of us, Leslie and myself and Vivian, would always say is advocacy for yourself is so important, really important.
Yeah. One thing that I think is generally comes up is, at what stage do you think it's important to start thinking about clinical trials? Because there's obviously a balance, particularly if you're on treatment, a treatment regime already, because there's often a balance between how well you are, particularly if you're responding well to a treatment regime that you're on. There's what point do you start looking towards a clinical trial as an alternative option? If you know that there's, I think it's, I'm thinking in secondary breast cancer, there's obviously there's often a lot of different options that you can, different, before you get to the end of the line, options where you're looking for clinical trials. But sometimes you might want to look earlier, might be similar in different cancers, but it's,
yeah, hear what you're saying.
Who wants to take that question?
What was the question again? It's never too early. Never too early.
Never too early. And I know that obviously blood cancers are very different in the approach with solid tumours because of the very nature of the diseases. But with blood cancers, I would say probably a good 25% of the patients that I've spoken to over the last year or so are patients who don't yet need treatment. They've been diagnosed with a blood cancer, but it's not, the disease hasn't kicked up into the next level yet, doesn't require treatment. And we've been able to have those conversations in advance where people are really informed, they know what's on the horizon, they're ready when they do need to start treatment to have those conversations with their treating team. So I appreciate it's slightly different within the blood cancer space, but it's never too early, and you're never at any particular time point. Just asking sometimes is enough for your team to recognise that you are showing that appetite to be involved in a clinical trial as well. So it might be that you're not eligible for anything at that particular time, but when something does come through in the future, they'll remember you and think, oh, I should really approach and see whether they're interested. So, you know, I would make it clear at any time point within your treatment journey.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite important, you know, for the person who was talking about the consultant that doesn't really engage in clinical trials and doesn't want to have that conversation. It's really an opportunity to start having those conversations, to let them know that you are interested in trials and you're not going anywhere. You know, you want to talk about that. So I think, you know, you can be stable on your current treatment, but it's a really good idea just to start thinking about trials, so they are more likely to think that you are going to consider that and potentially prepare to travel as well. If you're in a small hospital, but, you know, 40, 50 miles away, there might be something different and novel and interesting kind of thing that would be worth traveling for. Then it's a really good idea to start having those discussions, you know.
Yeah, I think because sometimes you know, you don't think about clinical trials until maybe there isn't, you know, you're not your the treatment that you're on is not working anymore, but then you might not be well enough then to be eligible for the clinical trial, and then by the time you start thinking about that, then there isn't a clinical trial available. So talking about traveling, is there are you able to apply for clinical trials in another country or only in the UK?
You can. Do you want to answer that, Leslie?
Well, I'm not sure now post Brexit what happens, but because I was looking at European trials, you know, a number before Brexit, and even in the States, you can. My understanding is you can access a trial, but States is probably completely unaffordable because you would need, you know, healthcare insurance as well. But yeah, I think I remember emailing my oncologist with trials in France and Germany. I mean, I've ended up on a trial that's just a train ride or a short drive away, which is incredible. But I would also just reiterate what Vivian has said about alerting your oncologist that if you're willing and able to travel, and I was lucky. And if you don't leave it too late, I mean, the other really frustrating issue for me is how difficult it is to access a trial, and how the trials are often set up for what I call the kind of cancer Olympians. So you have to be able to tick so many boxes and have had a limited number of treatment lines and be well, and, you know, and actually in the real world, that's not always your average patient. So that's another issue that somebody somewhere needs to help kind of resolve, to make it just a bit more, allow patients onto trials that are a bit more representative, basically, of that patient population. Just very frustrating. But I would say I started talking to my oncologist fairly early on during my first line of treatment. I mean, he wouldn't have considered it at that point because I did, you know, it was chemotherapy. I was doing fine on it. But if you, as Vivian and Helen have said, if you leave it too late, you will probably be too unwell to be eligible for that trial.
Yeah. Let's see if there's another question here. Wait, just somebody saying. Well, somebody was saying about actually moving oncologists. So I you know, it's actually it's still your right to request a change of doctor if you want to. So if your oncologist is not, somebody was saying their oncologist is not very knowledgeable or doesn't have the time to look into things like clinical trials, you know, if that was the case, I guess it's your right to request a change or second opinion, move oncologists if you need to do that for that reason, or look for somebody that has the knowledge or has information about clinical trials, if that's what you need to do, I guess.
It's quite difficult because there are a number of hospitals, a number of cancer hospitals that don't have clinical trials running in their facility. And that is very frustrating.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because of the complexity of some of our studies, they need to be delivered in a dedicated area. It wouldn't be appropriate. We need emergency equipment, we need emergency services. We are overcautious, but you know, we have to have a specialised area. So a lot of cancer hospitals could potentially run some of our later phase studies, but not always. So the frustration is, if you're being treated in a small, maybe cottage hospital, district hospital, something like that, the consultants maybe would love to do trials and love to talk to their patients about trials, but there's none happening in their hospital, and maybe feel they can't give them false hope, and maybe just don't think that they will be prepared to travel to another hospital 80 miles away, something like that. So patients aren't having those conversations. In my experience working with Make Seconds Count for the last 7 months, you know, patients are saying to me that when they mention clinical trials to their doctor and they say, you're not ready for trials yet. Clinical trials are potentially out there for lots of different time points, not just when you've run out of treatment options, you know, but
yeah,
because they maybe don't have that same experience of clinical trials, that's their belief. And that's frustrating to hear. So that's why it's good to ask those questions, to say, actually, do you know what, I want to keep my options open. I want to think that clinical trials might be appropriate for me at some point. So how do I go about finding that information, doctor? Because I am actually quite interested, and I would like to be considered for trials and see what happens there. And keep asking, just keep your options open.
Are there any websites that you would recommend to look at for clinical trials specifically? And would you say that that's something that a patient should look into themselves, or is that better to ask for an expert to support you with, or should patients be searching for trials themselves?
Some patients do search themselves, but I don't know whether it was Helen or Leslie talked about actually some of the websites that are available. They are confusing, and some of the information, you don't know when the full stop in the next sentence starts. It's really quite complex. So it's some are easier than others. There's clinicaltrials.gov, there's Be Part of Research. mytomorrows.com will do a search for you, but tends not to be too selective. So you might end up with quite a lot of information, some of which you might not meet the criteria for, but just putting those feelers out, getting that information. All information is good information, you know, and even having that information to take to your consultant to say, I've actually had a look myself, and these are the sort of things I've thought about. What are your thoughts on that? You know, so it's helping them to engage about clinical trials. I think they're the main ones that I tend to use. Cancer Research UK as well is good. Can you think of any more, Leslie and Helen?
I think Leslie and I have popped a few into the chat if it's helpful for people as well. The links are there. I think half the thing is trying, like Vivian has just said, is trying to find a trials finder that is actually written in a patient-friendly or patient-specific manner, but also one that's up to date, because quite frequently part of the disappointment, and I know that Vivian experiences this, I do too, is we isolate or identify a clinical trial for a patient and we're really excited and so thrilled that we've done it. And then actually when you query it, you find out that the trial is not recruiting at that site any longer. So I would always caveat any information that you find as that might not be what ends up happening. But again, I think it just comes straight back around to, if you take one message away from us today, Leslie and Vivian, it's just that it's okay to ask, and that you should be getting good responses on those questions, and that, you know, at the end of the day, if you are not getting the answers that you are really wanting, or that what you're wanting, but that if you're just not getting the responses that you were expecting, or you don't feel that you're being engaged properly by your treating team, keep asking those questions, or ask to see somebody else. It's just so very, very important that you have those opportunities.
Can I add, I just noticed on the chat, Rebecca has added a comment saying that she didn't realise you can also, as a patient, email the lead investigator yourself. You would still, I think, have to be referred by your consultant, but if you find a trial
Yeah, see that. Great. Okay, well, oh, sorry.
Jen, I was just going to add, it's interesting sometimes hearing from consultants as well that, you know, we've had these conversations with them and they've said, I think it was a consultant hematologist said that they have MDTs, which I'm sure everybody that's in the meeting today will be au fait with MDTs, where groups of individuals across varying different hospitals will talk about a patient's particular treatment journey and make decisions as a group about what the best thing is for that patient. And a hematologist said to me that quite frequently he's dialed into these MDTs and he can hear another consultant on the line say, oh yeah, so we're going to do this. And one of the consultants will say, oh, have you considered this clinical trial? Oh, I'm sure they won't want to travel. And this hematologist said to me, but did you ask them? So, you know, sometimes your consultant team or your treating team will make decisions on your behalf because they've not quite got the full feel of who you are as an individual as well. So again, it might just be miscommunication that if you let them know, it'll change the view.
Yeah.
And some trials, commercial ones, pharma ones, you'll get your travel expenses paid. So even though I'm on compassionate use access, I can't believe they still pay for my train or mileage through to Glasgow every 3 weeks after 6 years.
Cool. Well, sorry. Brilliant. I don't think there's any other questions. So I think we're coming up to 2 o'clock. So I think we'll just leave it there and say thank you very much to all our speakers, Leslie, Vivian and Helen. It's been really, really useful. I think a few comments in the chat saying that it's been really useful to people listening. So I think there's been a lot of information and yeah, really enlightening about the clinical trials. And Leslie, it's been great to hear your story, especially, and how well you're doing on the drug, and long may it continue. So thank you very much, Vivian, Helen and Leslie, and thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you.